we are going to learn about components of biodiversity. Biodiversity manifests itself at 5 hierarchical levels, namely genetic level, species level, community level, ecosystem level, and landscape level. Accordingly, it consists of 5 basic components, namely genetic diversity, species diversity, community diversity, and ecosystem diversity, along with landscape diversity. These are interlinked and they collectively constitute a common gene pool. So first one is the genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the diversity or variability of genes within and between species. So it implies that each member of a species differs widely from the others in its genetic makeup. Genetic diversity involves differences in alleles, entire genomes, or chromosome structure. Each species may have several varieties and each variety may have its own genetic makeup. Since wide ranges of gene combinations are possible, each variety or each member of a species will have its own characteristics different from those of others. Genetic diversity results from sexual reproduction, genetic recombination, mutation, and environmental influence. Sexual reproduction brings about the mixing of biparental, that is parental, paternal, and parental maternal genes and introduces new gene combinations into populations. This, in all probability, promote genetic diversity among the members of a species. Genetic diversity enables organisms to adapt themselves to their environments. Thus, in turn, embraces their fitness and survival value. It also serves as a raw material of natural selection, speciation, and organic evolution. So, the greater the genetic diversity, the greater would be their adaptability, fitness, survival value, and evolutionary potentiality within species and populations. Accumulation of favorable genetic variations or cumulative variations in the long run may result in speciation. Genetic variation also play a role in the maintenance of diversity at species and community levels. The genetic diversity of a community is directly proportional to the total number of its species. So the genetic diversity of a community is directly proportional to the total number of its species. So communities with more species will have higher genetic diversity than those with fewer species. Now next topic is the species diversity. Species diversity is the diversity or variability of the species of a community or region. More precisely, it is the variety of rare, unrelated or dissimilar species in a community or area. So higher the number of rare or unrelated species, the greater the species diversity. Species diversity is significant in that it promotes interspecific competition and thereby establishes and maintains community stability. So genetic diversity in a rabbit population can be seen, then that changes into species diversity in a grassland ecosystem like rabbit, sparrow, and snake. Then community and ecosystem diversity of a region. There are different kinds of biodiversities. So species diversity varies greatly between ecosystems. It is very high in ecotones, tropical rainforests and coral reef ecosystems, and low in isolated islands, deserts, and tundras. Species differ from each other and they do not normally interbreed. However, closely related species will have several genes in common, and some of such species may interbreed in captivity or domestication. That is the case of closely related species. Species diversity is related to two factors, namely species richness and species evenness. Species richness or species abundance is the abundance in the number of species in a community, so it represents the total number of species in a community or area. Species richness varies with communities, number, geographical regions, and environmental conditions. In general, species diversity is directly proportional to species richness. So, greater the species richness, the greater the species diversity. Species evenness or species equitability is the equitability or uniformity in the abundance and distribution of different species of a community, area, or ecosystem. It represents the ratio or proportion between the different species or functional groups. Species evenness or species equitability is the equitability of or uniformity in the abundance and distribution of the different species of a community, area, or ecosystem. It is very high when all the members of a community have approximately the same number of individuals. Conversely, it is very low when the numerical abundance is different among different species. Some species having much numerous members and others having only very few members. Thus, species evenness and species diversity have an inverse relation to each other. So, greater the species evenness, the lesser the species diversity. Now let's learn about the species diversity index, which are the different species diversity indexes. Before moving on to that, let's once again read what is species evenness. Species evenness or species equitability is the equitability or uniformity in the abundance and distribution of the different species of a community, area, or ecosystem. It represents the ratio or proportion between different species of a community or area or ecosystem. It represents the ratio or proportion between the different species or functional groups of a community or region. It is very high when all the species of a community have approximately the same number of individuals. Conversely, it is very low when the numerical abundance is different among different species. Some species having much numerous members and others having only very few members. Thus, species evenness and species diversity have an inverse relation to each other. So, the greater the species evenness, the lesser the species diversity. Now, we are going to learn about the species diversity index. Species diversity index is the mathematical expression of the species diversity of a given community or area. It represents the ratio between the number of species and their biomass and productivity with reference to a particular community. Also, it indicates the relative abundance of the different species of a community. What is this? It represents the ratio between the number of species and their biomass and productivity with reference to a particular community. Also, it indicates the relative abundance of the relative species of a community. Species diversity indices are generally considered to be important means for comparison of community structure and community stability. There are several such indices: Shannon-Weaver Index, Simpson's Diversity Index, Equitability Index, Species Richness Index, etc. are examples. So first one is the Shannon-Weaver Species Diversity Index. എന്താണ് Species Diversity Index? Species Diversity Index is the mathematical expression of the species diversity of a given community or area. It represents the ratio between the number of species and their biomass and productivity with reference to a particular community. Also, it indicates the relative abundance of the different species of a community. Species diversity indices are generally considered to be important means for comparison of community structure and community stability. There are several such indices. First one is the Shannon-Weaver Species Diversity Index. Shannon-Weaver Species Diversity Index or Information Index is a measure derived from information theories. It is an applied form of information theory used for the analysis of natural biotic communities. Biotic communities. It was formulated by Claude E. Shannon and Norbert Wiener in 1948. Wiener, and then published by Shannon and Warren Weaver in 1949. Shannon Diversity Index is used to measure the overall information provided by sample community. If a community is composed of S number of species, all having the same number of individuals, the probability of finding or collecting each species is 1 by S. The information I provided by the capture of a species is inversely proportional to the probability of finding it. Thus, I is equal to f of x, a function of S. The total information provided by the finding of two individual species is the sum of the information relative to the two events. If the total number of the individuals is large enough, the probability of capture of one individual is independent of the probability of capture of a second one. This can be mathematically expressed as f of s1, s2 is equal to f of s1 plus f of s2 is equal to f of s1 plus s2 bracket. It is a logarithmic function. The total information provided by the entire community having a species of equal number of individuals can be expressed as follows, where 1 is equal to summation log, I is equal to summation log S. Summation stands for summation. The average information provided by each species is 1 by I is equal to minus summation log 1si by 1si, where I can have values ranging from 1 to s and log si is equal to minus log 1 by si. If all the captures or events are considered independent, then the total information provided by the entire community is equal to I is equal to negative summation log 1 by s1 into 1 by s1. The si. The different species of natural communities will never have identical number of individuals. So the probability of capture varies from one species to another. The total information H, which represents the entropy of the whole community, is expressed by the Shannon-Weaver equation as follows. Hs is equal to the total information, which represents the entropy of the whole community, is equal to negative pi into log pi, where pi is equal to 1 by si. In practice, pi is replaced by m by n, where n is the number of individuals of species and n is the total number of individuals in the sample considered. The higher the value of Hs, the greater would be the species diversity of the community, greater number of species, or there will be more distribution of individuals between the species, or both. Suppose there is a population of 100 members, then the following probabilities and index values can be repeated. There is only a single species, then the species diversity index is 0. There are 5 species, each with 20 members, H is equal to 1.61. Then there are 100 species, each with 1 member. Then the species diversity increases to a greater extent, like 4.61. The Shannon Diversity Index has two components, namely the number of species present in a community and their equitability, or the relative distribution of individuals between the species. The index becomes higher with an increase in the number of species and also with a more equal number of individuals in the species. So the Shannon Diversity Index has two components, namely the number of species present in community and their equitability, or the relative distribution of individuals between the species. The index becomes higher with the increase in number of species and also with the more equal number of individuals in the species. രണ്ട് കമ്പണൻസ് ആണ് ഇതിനുള്ളത്. ഏതൊക്കെയാണെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ, ഒന്നാമതായിട്ട് നമ്പർ ഓഫ് സ്പീഷീസ് പ്രസൻറ്റ് ഇൻ എ കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റിയിലെ നമ്പർ ഓഫ് സ്പീഷീസുകൾ. അടുത്തതായിട്ട് ഈക്വിറ്റബിലിറ്റി. ഈ ഒരു ഇൻഡിവിജ്വൽ സ്പീഷീസ് അതിലുള്ള ഇൻഡിവിജ്വൽസ് എങ്ങനെയാണ് സ്പീഷീസിൽ ഡിസ്ട്രിബ്യൂട്ട് ആയിരിക്കുന്നത് എന്നുള്ളതിൻ്റെ ഇക്വിറ്റബിലിറ്റി. ദർ ഇസ് റിലേറ്റീവ് ഡിസ്ട്രിബ്യൂഷൻ ഓഫ് ഇൻഡിവിജ്വൽസ് ബിറ്റ്വീൻ ദ സ്പീഷീസ്. ദ ഇൻഡെക്സ് ബിക്കം ഹയർ വെൻ നമ്പർ ഓഫ് സ്പീഷീസും പിന്നെ ഈക്വിറ്റബിലിറ്റി, ഈ രണ്ട് ഫാക്ടേഴ്സാണ് ഇവിടെ ഉള്ളത്. The index become higher with an increase in the number of species and also with a more equal number of individuals in the species. Now move on to the next species diversity index, that is the Simpson's diversity index. Simpson's diversity index is a statistical method employed for calculating the species diversity of different ecosystems by making use of the relative abundance of different species. The system has formulated by Edward Hugh Simpson. It is most usually expressed as D is equal to summation n minus 1 divided by capital N into capital N minus 1, where D is equal to Simpson's index, whose value is between 0 and 1, and N, capital N, the total number of organisms of all species, small n, the total number of organisms of a particular species. For calculating Simpson's diversity index, the data regarding the number of different species and the number of times each species is found that their frequencies are required. Simpson's index is ideal or best suited for relatively small simple sizes. The diversity index of a perfectly homogeneous population would be 0, while the Simpson index of a perfectly heterogeneous population would be 0. 0 means would be 1. 0 is equal to no diversity. No diversity, which shows the homogeneous condition. When this is heterogeneous condition, maximum heterogeneity, then the Simpson index will be 1. So all this are already explained. We have next set, that is the community diversity and ecosystem diversity. Community diversity and ecosystem diversity. Community diversity is the diversity in the composition of communities. Community diversity is the diversity in the composition of communities, whereas ecosystem diversity is the diversity of the composition of ecosystems. Community diversity is the diversity in the composition of communities, whereas ecosystem diversity is the diversity in the composition of ecosystems. So they represent the variability in the continental or global distribution of communities or ecosystem types. There are different kinds of habitats and ecosystems on Earth. They differ from each other in physical features, climatic conditions, and biotic components. The species living in each habitat or area may be especially adapted to the abiotic and biotic environments of that habitat. So biodiversity varies with communities and ecosystems. The biodiversity or species richness of a subset of a community is called point diversity. The biodiversity or species richness of a subset of a community is called point diversity. Community diversity is directly proportional to it. Thus, the higher the point diversity, the greater would be the community diversity. What is point diversity? The diversity or species richness of a subset of a community is called point diversity. Next one is the landscape diversity. Community diversity, species diversity. Now we are going to learn about this. Landscape diversity. Landscape is a spatially heterogeneous stretch of land with different types of landforms, water resources, habitats, ecosystems, and vegetation, which are collectively called landscape elements. It may consist of different types of ecosystems such as grasslands, forests, wetlands, ponds, lakes, and agroecosystems, urban settlings, and so on. Landscape diversity refers to the diversity within and between landscapes with respect to the extent, composition, and connectivity of their constituent landscape elements. Landscape diversity has a direct bearing on the biodiversity of landscapes. So let's learn about the levels of biodiversity. There are three levels of community diversity and ecosystem diversity, namely alpha diversity, beta diversity, and gamma diversity. So first one is the alpha diversity. What was the first one of level of biodiversity? There are actually three levels of community diversity and ecosystem diversity, namely alpha diversity, beta diversity, and gamma diversity. Alpha diversity. Alpha diversity is the diversity or richness of species within a single habitat, community, or ecosystem. Diversity within a single habitat, community, or ecosystem. So it represents the number of different species in a habitat, community, or ecosystem. It represents the number of different species in a habitat, community, or ecosystem. Next is the beta diversity. Beta diversity is the diversity or richness of species or the species composition along a gradient from one community to other or within a range of several communities of a region. It represents the diversity of species among local communities. Next is the gamma diversity. Gamma diversity is the diversity or richness of species within several ranges of communities of several regions. It represents the overall diversity among the different ecosystems of a given area. It represents the overall diversity among the different ecosystems of a large area. In brief, alpha diversity involves the diversity of organisms of a same community or habitat. Beta diversity is the diversity of species along a gradient of several communities. Gamma diversity is the diversity of species and habitats over a vast geographical area or landscape. Vast geographical area or landscape.